Analytical. We typically study human cognition as a series of disconnected theoretical silos. Neuroscience, logic, linguistics, and theology each claim a different territory, assuming that the biological brain and the abstract soul operate under separate laws. The Brain Kinematics Model provides a different starting point, viewing cognition as a single, continuous process. This suggests a new line of inquiry, how a single, evolving organizational state inside the brain maps across such drastically different representational languages. The distinctions we draw between dreams, math, and philosophy appear as representational boundaries. Each is a specific projection of the same underlying organizational reality. Within the BKM, a thought is not a discrete sentence or an isolated image. It is a high-dimensional, evolving structure. This structure possesses immense geometric depth. To be shared, it must undergo compression into a specific language. We call this topological projection. The complex internal state is cast into a lower dimensional format, like a 3D object casting a 2D shadow. Spoken words and mathematical equations serve as lower dimensional shadows of a much richer, unseeable cognitive architecture. We can view narrative and logical languages as two distinct projection planes for this organizational terrain. Narrative language preserves the mountains of our cognition: episodic continuity, emotional topology, and memory attractors. Logical language focuses on the paths between them. It preserves inference, causality, structural consistency, and abstraction. Neither projection contains the entire source organization, yet both accurately describe the same internal data. This explains why certain translations are weak. A dream does not map directly to mathematics because their projection planes share too few invariants. They require intermediate languages to bridge the gap. The identity of a thought survives in the invariant mathematical structures shared across all of its possible projections. This framework distinguishes two cognitive acts that are often conflated: translation and interpretation. Translation is a horizontal mapping operation. It assumes a constant organizational state and merely morphs the representational syntax from one language to another. Interpretation is a vertical, inverse operation. It attempts to reconstruct a hidden source organization from a lower dimensional representation. This reconstruction is inherently non-unique. Because multiple high-dimensional structures can cast the same two-dimensional shadow, interpretation requires the observer to make an active choice. Translating the sentence, "I climbed a mountain with a lamp," is a mechanical mapping, but interpreting that dream requires reconstructing its physiological or spiritual origin, a move from the shadow back to the source. Interpretation forces the observer to reconstruct reality from incomplete projections, marking it as a creative act rather than a passive transfer of meaning. We see this continuum reflected in history. Human thought moves from symbolically dominant myths to the conceptual extreme of modern logic and mathematics. Between these poles sits the symbolic layer, which translates between lived experiential organization and abstract logic. This layer explains the endurance of sacred texts. Rather than utilizing explicit logic, these works rely on narratives that preserve high-dimensional organizational structures across generations. Suhrawardi's The Red Wisdom operates as an organizational simulation. By encoding metaphysics into characters and journeys, it allows the reader to participate in a complex organization before conceptualizing it. Mulla Sadra took the opposite path, starting with conceptual architecture and using symbols to aid in the final realization of the theory. Ancient myths function as sophisticated, high-dimensional data compression formats, preserving complex organizational states across millennia. Mulla Sadra's principle of the unity of the knower and the known serves as an index of organizational coupling. Literal translation requires minimal transformation. The observer's cognitive state remains static while the words change. Interpretation demands more. To reconstruct the source organization, the knower must internally reorganize their own cognitive geometry to map the text's representational world. At the theoretical limit, the observer's internal topology perfectly mirrors the source manifold, a state described as illumination. At this level of integration, knowledge shifts toward active ontological participation, a state where knowing and being converge. Realization requires the brain to structurally become the concept it is observing. effectively collapsing the boundary between the knower and the known. The historical survival of an idea depends on the richness of its representational encoding. Rigid conceptual frameworks often have a short cultural shelf life. Symbolic and sacred narratives endure for millennia. Narrative outlasts logic because its high dimensionality allows each new generation to retranslate the underlying organizational simulation into its own contemporary concepts. A cognitive theory's power is measured by its topological resilience, its ability to survive continuous translation across history. Continuity theory posits that no single representational language completely captures organizational reality. A core project within this framework is to map the exact organizational invariants that survive translation across dreams, mathematics, and bodily states. Understanding consciousness requires embracing the unified translation between our physical bodies, abstract logic, and symbolic narratives. In this view, the mind approaches reality through structural resonance, achieving a final state of unity with the known.